Hello and welcome back to a brand new video. Today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite bands of the 70s, 10cc, and their self-titled debut album, 10cc. 10cc were a really interesting group that occupied a niche that I don't think really exists anymore, where on the one hand, they were smart, savvy popsters for people who were too good for pop music. On the other hand, they were smart, savvy popsters who made amazing pop music. And then there was a breakup and two of them left and they just kind of turned into a straight up pop band and eventually got very, very, very bad. And the other two guys went away and made a crazy triple disc rock opera about the weather, going mad and trying to kill humanity. And it was a titanic flop. And then they went and made a couple of good albums, and then the 80s came along and they got addicted to drum machines and weird R&B influenced pseudo hip hop, and yeah, eventually I'm going to talk about that. But anyway, 10cc, really good band, really fun, made up of two quartets, made up during their golden age of two duos, really good music, good album, one of my favorite albums by them. So yeah, track reviews. So the album opens up with some interesting little pseudo-orchestrated stuff. I forgot to mention in the intro that these guys had their own studio, so they actually got to mess around a lot more than a lot of their contemporaries did. Which then leads us into a really fun doo-wop pastiche mocking the teenaged death songs of the 1950s and 60s, which were actually a really big thing at one point in time. There's a lot of, these songs about young lovers dying horribly, and it was this big thing in pop for years. This track is both sort of making fun of it, but sort of doing it straight at the same time. Suddenly a truck pulled out, he tried to step on the brake. Which is one of the brilliant things to me about this album. But yeah, it's a great, great track. I especially love the deep harmonies that I think it's Kevin Godley is doing. It's very Zappa-ish, and it really helps add the doo-wop feel to the track. So track 2 is Sand in My Face, and it is an absolute gem. One of the best 10cc tracks. It introduces us to the sort of Brian Wilson meets 60s Zappa thing that's going to define a lot of early 10cc. There's a lot of multi-part tracks, lots of different vocal and instrumental melodies going on, and it's very story-focused, which was a big thing in pop music around this time. Not so much anymore, but in the early 70s. And in this case, the entire thing is spoofing Charles Atlas advertisements and the sort of, we'll make a man out of you kind of deals. Because it's a story of a man who lost my girl down by the beach and his eventual journey to reclaim his woman and kicked sand in the face of his rival. This is the big hit, with the Lowell Cream falsetto. It's very similar to Oh Darling by the Beatles, but you know what? That's a pretty generic progression to begin with. When I eventually cover Cruising with Ruben and the Jets, I'll go into more detail on this. The thing about doo-wop, I'm pretty convinced there were only ever about 8 doo-wop songs actually existing. So there is a sort of inherent genericism to a lot of it. And very much like Johnny Don't Do It, it is sort of ridiculous, but also kind of straight at the same time. And speaking of McCartney, I love the little response section after the line about the telephone. The Dean and I is quite possibly the best track on this album. Lots of little parts, amazing vocal melodies, amazing instrumental bits, total Beach Boys pastiche to the point where it actually basically quotes verbatim "Then I Kissed Her" at one point. And then I kissed her. And when I kissed, then I kissed her. Just absolutely wonderful track. one of the major bits that made me fall in love with this band when I originally discovered them. I like this track a lot, but it is a slight step down from the first bunch of songs. But I still love the biting satiric wit. It has a great witty lyric about scandal-mongering journalists and the extents to which they will go to get a story. The thing about this album is that it is very front-loaded. The best stuff is almost all on the first side. And while there are high points on side 2, the song quality is not on the same level. And this is a great example of it. I like it. It's a good track. I love the massive overdriven guitar thing happening here. But it's always felt just a little bit fillerish to me. This, on the other hand, is absolutely phenomenal. If Donna is Oh Darling turned inside out, then this is Jailhouse Rock. Completely inverted. You could argue it is sort of just a riff on that track, but wow, what a perfect single. It's, once again, very Beach Boys-ish, very early 60s, very compelling, a lot of different melodies, changes, cool, weird high falsettos, just fun, witty, interesting stuff with a lot to bring the listener back again and again and again. And I'm probably not doing a good job of selling these tracks. The Hospital Song is a track that I know a lot of people do not like, and I will be the first to admit it gets pretty nasty lyrically. When sister brings that deadpan round, I'll piss like April shower. But I enjoy the music, and for the longest time when I first got this album, this was the point where I usually turned it off, which I don't quite understand, but this has always scanned to me as being very fillerish. It's not a bad track, like I said, with Speed Kills, and in fact, in some respects, I think I might even like it better. Out of the 2 Goldman Stewart compositions on the album, this is the one that feels the most Eric Stewart to me. And as we'll see later on when I eventually do 10cc Mark II versus Godley and Cream, the Eric Stewart thing is, I like it, but it's not my favorite thing in the world. So we end the album with a rather sad track, a sort of McCartney-esque ballad about the mother the singer leaves behind when he leaves the big city to start his new life, and her ensuing death. And it's a really good track, although not one that I turn on all the time when I'm listening to this album. And like I said, I have a tendency to turn the album off somewhere around the Hospital Song. But listening to it for this review, I really like this. It reminds me just a little bit of Little Lamb Dragonfly from Red Rose Speedway, the second Wings album. And it's not as good as that track, but I definitely enjoy it. So that was 10cc, a wonderful album, one of my absolute favorites from this group. On a lot of days, probably my number one. For me, it's this or Deceptive Bends. Sheet music is right up there too. Really, the only slight dud of the original run of 10cc albums is the original soundtrack, which has some absolute classics on there, but The Film of My Love and Flying Junk are not very good. And Deceptive Bends, even the first album after Godley and Cream left, is a really good album. Hell, I'll be honest with you, even Bloody Tourists has some really, really good stuff. It's only really with Look Here and 10 out of 10 that 10cc kind of flatline, which fascinatingly enough is also at the point where Godley and Cream get really, really weird. And I will probably be covering Ismism at some point relatively soon. If you haven't figured it out from what I said earlier, at some point I'm going to do this like Battle of the Bands, solo Godley and Cream, first few albums versus 5cc or 10cc Mark II first few albums, and I want to do that. And this is kind of a prologue to that, but it's also an album that I love and that I've wanted to cover for a long, long, long time, and that I really want to introduce to some new people who might not have ever heard of these guys. I myself heard about 10cc for years and years before I ever checked them out, and as soon as I checked them out, it was like, why didn't I find out about these guys in like 2011? So yeah, hopefully you all will benefit from my mistakes and get into this wonderful band. But anyway, I will see you all later. I have like 5 or 6 reviews in the pipeline. I don't know which one is going to be first. I think maybe the next review is going to be Gentle Giant, but we'll see. Either way, I look forward to getting you some more content relatively soon. So until then,